Danielle Brooks knelt on the cold marble floor of the grand kitchen, her fingers raw and stinging as she scrubbed at a persistent wine stain. The fourth time she went over the spot, she prayed the shadow on the stone would finally vanish. But the marble remained marked. Perfection was the only thing that kept her invisible, and invisibility was the only thing keeping her safe. A miracle had never come for her, and she didn't expect one to start in a house built on blood and secrets. The sharp crack of crystal hitting the floor inches from her hand made her spine stiffen. Seo Hye-rin stood over her, a half-empty glass of vintage red still gripped in her manicured hand, her cold smile dripping with more venom than the wine. "You missed a spot, Danielle," she purred, her designer heels grinding a shard of glass into the floorboards. "If this isn't spotless by the time the guests arrive, you can find a new place to sleep. Maybe the street will be more your speed." Danielle's hands trembled as she reached for the new shards. Outside, the summer heat shimmered over the estate's manicured gardens, but inside the house, it felt like a tomb. The silence of the mansion was heavy, pressing against her like an angry fist. She stared at the bucket of gray water. 6 months of silence, 6 months of playing the ghost. Her back ached, but she ignored it. She'd gotten used to the physical toll of being replaceable. The lights of the chandelier overhead flickered as a power surge hummed through the house. She held her breath, praying for the quiet to hold. Everything in this house was fragile. Everything was on the verge of breaking. Her pocket buzzed, a quiet, rhythmic vibration. It was a text from Min Jun's tablet sent from the nursery upstairs. "Soo-ah is crying again. She says the pretty lady took her bear and threw it in the water. Please come back soon." Danielle looked toward the window. In the distance, near the rose bushes, the new gardener was hunched over, his baseball cap pulled low, his movements too controlled for a man just pulling weeds. He was watching the house. He was always watching. The morning mist still clung to the meticulously manicured hedges of the Kang estate, when the silence was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic slapping sound. Danielle didn't need to look up from the silver she was polishing to know what was happening. It was the sound of Seo Hye-rin's heels striking the marble, a frantic, angry staccato that signaled a coming storm. "Where is it? Where is that disgusting, flea-bitten rag?" Hye-rin's voice screeched through the hallway, vibrating with a venom that seemed to sour the very air. Danielle set down the silver cloth, her alert eyes immediately darting to the corner where 5-year-old Soo-ah usually hid. The little girl was there, huddled behind a velvet curtain, her face pale and her tiny hands trembling as she clutched a worn, headless teddy bear. Hye-rin burst into the room, her designer silk robe billowing behind her like the wings of a predatory bird. She spotted the girl and lunged. "I told you that filth was going in the incinerator, Soo-ah. It's a breeding ground for germs. It's an eyesore." Before Hye-rin's manicured hand could reach the child, a shadow moved. Danielle stepped between them with a movement so fluid and silent it seemed as though she had simply materialized from the walls. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even lift her chin. She simply stood there, a modest barrier in a crisp maid's uniform. "The young lady was just taking it to the laundry, Miss Seo," Danielle said softly, her voice a calm anchor in the chaos. "I'll personally sanitize it. There's no need for you to trouble yourself with such a menial task." Hye-rin's eyes flashed with a cruel, insecure fire. She hated Danielle's composure. It made her feel unrefined. "Move, you replaceable cockroach, or do you want to join the bear in the fire?" Danielle didn't move. She felt the faint burn mark on her wrist prickle, a phantom memory of a harder past. She shifted her weight slightly, a subtle adjustment of her center of gravity that would allow her to intercept any strike before it landed. The master would be displeased if the children were distressed before their lessons, Danielle reminded her, her tone respectful but lined with a hidden vein of cold authority. Hye-rin snarled, retreating only when she realized she couldn't break the maid's gaze. "Get it out of my sight," she spat, turning on her heel and marching away. Outside the window, 20 yards away, Mr. Kang, the gardener, was hunched over a patch of wilting peonies. To anyone else, he looked like a man struggling with a spade. But beneath the brim of his dirt-stained baseball cap, his eyes were fixed on the glass. Tucked into the collar of his weathered overalls was a miniature high-definition lens, recording every second of the confrontation. He watched Danielle kneel to scoop the sobbing Seo into a protective embrace, her movements professional yet deeply compassionate. Joon-seok felt a twinge of something he hadn't felt in years: curiosity. He had come here to find a traitor, but as he closed his black book of digital recordings, he realized he had found something far more rare. He had found a shield. The moon was a sliver of bone hanging over the estate, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of blue hydrangeas. Inside the servants' quarters, the silence was thick, but Danielle couldn't sleep. The way the gardener had looked at her during the confrontation with Hye-rin, his eyes sharp and predatory beneath that frayed cap, had set her nerves on fire. It wasn't the gaze of a man who cared about peonies. She slipped out of her room, moving with the practiced weightlessness of a shadow. She didn't carry a flashlight. She didn't need one. Her internal compass guided her toward the tool shed at the edge of the property, a place that smelled of damp earth and oil. As she approached, she saw a faint, rhythmic blue light pulsing through the cracks in the wooden door. Then came the voice, low, gravelly, and stripped of the rustic, bumbling accent the gardener used during the day. "The shipment at Incheon is a distraction," the man hissed into a sleek satellite phone. "Do-hyun is moving the real assets through the northern docks. I want the surveillance logs for Hye-rin's private accounts by dawn. If a single one is missing, burn the whole thing down." Danielle didn't hesitate. She kicked the door open, her hand already reaching for the ceramic paring knife tucked into the small of her back. The gardener reacted before the door hit the wall. He didn't scramble, he surged. In a blur of motion, he dropped the phone and lunged. Danielle spun, parrying his outstretched arm, but he was faster than any gardener had a right to be. He caught her wrist, twisting it with surgical precision, while his other hand drew a tactical folding blade from his pocket. They froze. Danielle's knife was pressed against the soft skin of his throat, just below the jawline. His blade was angled upward, the tip resting against the pulse point in her neck. "You're not a gardener," Danielle breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "And you're not just a maid," Joon-seok countered, his eyes dark and dangerous. The baseball cap had fallen off, revealing the sharp, commanding lines of his face and the faint eyebrow scar that signaled a life of violence. "That paring knife is a hobbyist's tool, but the way you're holding it, that's military." The blue light of the satellite phone on the floor illuminated the tension between them. Danielle didn't lower her weapon. "I overheard you. You're looking for the traitor. You're looking for Do-hyun." Joon-seok's grip on her wrist tightened slightly, but his eyes softened with a grim realization. "If you wanted me dead, you would have sliced my carotid when the door opened. You're protecting the kids." "I'm the only one who is," she whispered. Slowly, Joon-seok retracted his blade. Danielle lowered hers, though she didn't put it away. "My name is Kang Joon-seok," he said, the authority in his voice finally matching his imposing frame. "This is my house, and it seems we've both been hiding in the same shadow." The morning air felt thin and sharp, carrying the scent of damp soil and the impending arrival of Baek Do-hyun. Joon-seok, back in his weathered green overalls, worked the earth near the south fountain, his movements intentionally heavy and clumsy. He kept his baseball cap low, but his ears were tuned to the heavy, deliberate footfalls approaching from the terrace. Baek Do-hyun stood at the edge of the stone path, a stocky silhouette in a charcoal suit that looked like armor. He didn't speak at first. He simply watched, his intimidating stare boring into Joon-seok's back. Do-hyun was a man who lived in the details. And something about the gardener didn't sit right in his gut. The calluses on the man's hands were too fresh, his silence too disciplined. "You," Do-hyun barked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Joon-seok paused, wiping a streak of dirt across his forehead before slowly turning. He bowed low, a perfect imitation of a man who feared his betters. "Yes, sir." Do-hyun stepped onto the grass, his thick gold ring glinting in the pale light. He gestured toward a vibrant patch of wild sunflowers and snapdragons near the gazebo, the one place in the estate that felt alive. It was the children's secret garden, the patch Danielle had helped them plant to escape Hye-rin's coldness. "The mistress says these are an eyesore," Do-hyun lied, his eyes never leaving Joon-seok's face. "Rip them out, all of them. Salt the earth afterward." Joon-seok felt a surge of white-hot fury ripple through his chest. He knew this wasn't Hye-rin's order. This was a psychological probe. Do-hyun was testing his obedience and his humanity. To destroy the one thing that gave Min-jun and Seo joy was a cruel loyalty test designed to see if the gardener would flinch. From the sunroom balcony, Danielle watched the scene unfold, her hands tightening around a tray of tea. She saw the tension in the gardener's shoulders, the minute clenching of his jaw that only someone trained in combat would recognize. She held her breath, praying he wouldn't break cover. Joon-seok looked at the snapdragons, then back at Do-hyun's expectant, shark-like grin. "Of course, sir, if that is what is required." He picked up a heavy spade. With a gut-wrenching finality, he drove the blade into the soft earth, severing the stems of the flowers Seo had watered just that morning. Each strike of the spade felt like a betrayal, a cold necessity in the war for his kingdom. Do-hyun watched for a long minute, his suspicions somewhat dampened by the gardener's cold efficiency, before finally turning away. As soon as the heavy doors closed behind the right-hand man, Joon-seok dropped the spade. His hands were shaking. He didn't see Danielle approach until she was standing right beside the ruined patch, her eyes reflecting his own quiet rage. "You had to," she whispered, kneeling to gather the broken blooms. "I'll make him eat every one of these stems before this is over," Joon-seok rasped, his true voice bleeding through the disguise. "Every single one." The afternoon heat hung heavy and stagnant over the estate, as suffocating as the tension inside the drawing room. Danielle stood by the mahogany sideboard, her hands moving with mechanical precision as she prepared the afternoon tea service. Her eyes, however, never left Seo Hye-rin. Hye-rin was packing the length of the Persian rug, her designer heels clicking with a jagged, nervous energy. In her hand, she held a small, amber vial. She stopped by the porcelain teacups meant for Min-jun and Seo, her back turned to the door, and tilted the vial. Danielle watched the reflection in the polished silver tray. 3 drops of a clear, viscous liquid disappeared into the aromatic Earl Grey. "Danielle," Hye-rin called out, her voice unnervingly sweet as she turned around, the vial already vanished into the pocket of her silk robe. "The children have been so restless today. I've added a special herbal supplement to their tea to help them settle down. Bring it to them immediately." Danielle bowed, her face a mask of ironclad obedience. "Of course, Miss Seo." As she carried the tray toward the sunroom, the scent reached her. It wasn't just bergamot. Years of working as a nurse in the city's harshest wards had sharpened her senses to a lethal edge. Beneath the tea's fragrance was a faint, metallic odor, chloral hydrate. In a high dose, it wouldn't just settle the children, it would suppress their respiratory systems, leaving them in a sleep they might never wake from. She rounded the corner into the hallway just as a loud crash echoed from the kitchen, Madame Yoon dropping a stack of plates. It was the only window she needed. With the fluid grace of a card shark, Danielle's hands blurred. She swapped the poisoned cups with 2 fresh ones she had hidden beneath the linen service napkins, then moved the tainted tea to the saucer designated for Hye-rin. In the sunroom, the children looked up with wide, fearful eyes. Danielle offered them a reassuring wink, a silent signal they had learned to trust implicitly. She placed the clean tea before them and moved to the terrace where Hye-rin was now sitting, watching them like a hawk. "Your tea, Miss Seo," Danielle murmured, setting the poisoned cup down. Hye-rin smiled, a cold, triumphant expression. She picked up the cup and took a long, arrogant sip, her eyes fixed on the children as she waited for them to drift off. "Is it to your liking?" Danielle asked. Hye-rin didn't answer. She was already beginning to blink slowly, her hand trembling as she set the cup back down. Danielle stood perfectly still, watching the woman who had tried to silence two innocent children fall victim to her own malice. Through the glass doors, Danielle caught the gardener's reflection in the garden fountain. He was standing perfectly still, his spade forgotten, watching the terrace with a dark, knowing approval. The first trap had been sprung, and the hunter was now the prey. The following morning, a heavy, artificial quiet settled over the estate as Hye-rin remained confined to her suite, claiming a migraine that Danielle knew was the lingering haze of the sedative. While the rest of the staff moved with hushed efficiency, Danielle took the opportunity to wax the floors of the West Wing, her movements rhythmic and purposeful. She reached the heavy oak doors of the private study, the epicenter of the house's secrets. Just as she was about to turn back, the sound of muffled, urgent voices filtered through the wood. She didn't freeze. Instead, she lowered her center of gravity and applied her ear to the door, her breathing becoming shallow and silent. "The sedative was a failure, Hye-rin. You're becoming sloppy." Baek Do-hyun's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "The gardener is looking at us with eyes that have seen too much. And Joon-seok, he's been silent for too long. His business trip feels like a trap." "He's dead weight, Do-hyun," Hye-rin hissed, her voice sharp with desperation. "The children are the only things keeping his loyalists in line. If we remove the head, the body will follow us. We have the signatures. We have the offshore accounts ready." "Then we don't wait for his return," Do-hyun replied, the sound of a heavy ring clacking against a glass table signaling his resolve. "We retire him permanently. Tonight, when the transport arrives at the docks, he won't find a welcome party. He'll find a firing squad. Once he's gone, the maid and the brats are a Sunday afternoon cleanup." Danielle felt a cold chill settle in her marrow. They weren't just plotting a coup, they were planning an execution. She realized then that Joon-seok's disguise was no longer a shield, it was a target. If he went to the docks tonight as the boss, returning from his trip, he would be walking into a slaughterhouse. She pulled away from the door just as footsteps approached from the other side. She was already halfway down the hall, her cloth buffing the floor with a dull, steady thud when Do-hyun stepped out. He watched her for a moment, his stocky frame silhouetted against the light, before grunting and walking in the opposite direction. Danielle didn't wait. She bypassed the kitchen and slipped out the service entrance, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She found the gardener in the greenhouse, his back to her as he methodically pruned the dead leaves from a row of ferns. "They know," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation fans. "The docks, tonight, it's not a homecoming, Joon-seok, it's an ambush." The gardener didn't turn around, but his hand stilled on the shears. The tension in his shoulders was like a coiled spring. "I expected as much," he rasped, his voice dropping the gardener's mask entirely. "But I didn't expect them to move this fast." "You can't go," Danielle insisted, stepping closer. "I have to go," Joon-seok turned, his eyes burning with a cold, predatory light. "But I'm not going alone." The humid air of the greenhouse was thick with the scent of damp moss and iron. Joon-seok stood by the potting bench, his movements slow and deliberate, while Danielle adjusted the ventilation slats nearby. To any watcher in the main house, it was a mundane morning of estate maintenance. But to those who knew how to look, the greenhouse had become a combat theater. "The root of a weed is like a man's throat, Danielle," Joon-seok said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. He held up a thick dandelion. "If you pull from the top, the heart remains. You have to get beneath the surface. Find the leverage and twist." He handed her a long, narrow trowel. Danielle took it, her fingers brushing against his calloused palm. The heat in the room wasn't just from the sun. It was the intensity of the man standing inches from her. "Show me," he commanded. Danielle reached for a potted fern, but Joon-seok shifted his weight, blocking her path with his shoulder. It was a subtle move, a gardener accidentally in the way, but it was actually a check on her perimeter. "Don't just look at the plant," he whispered, leaning in as if explaining the soil pH. "Look at the reflection in the glass behind it. Use the silver of the watering can as a mirror. If Do-hyun sends a man through that door, you don't reach for a gun. You reach for whatever is heavy and sharp." He gestured to a row of hanging shears. "If they close the distance, you don't retreat. You step into their space. Break their rhythm. A gardener doesn't run from the briar, he cuts through it." Danielle nodded, her eyes narrowing as she mentally mapped the room. She practiced the leveraging motion he had described, her wrists snapping with a speed that made the air whistle. "You've done this before," Joon-seok noted, his gaze lingering on the faint burn mark on her wrist. "The way you hold that trowel, you were trained to save lives, but you know exactly how to end them." "I was a nurse in a war zone, Joon-seok," she replied, her voice steady. "I've seen what happens when you aren't fast enough." Joon-seok reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before he pulled back, maintaining the professional distance of their roles. "Tonight, speed is everything. When the transport hits the docks, I need to know the kids are secure. Hye-rin will strike the moment she thinks I'm cornered. You are the only shield they have." He handed her a small, weighted pruning knife with a matte black finish. "Consider this a gardening tip. Never let them see the blade until it's already inside." Danielle tucked the knife into the waistband of her uniform, hidden by the folds of her apron. She looked at the gardener, the Mafia king, and saw the same terrifying clarity in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. The training was over. The harvest was coming. The heavy iron gates of the estate groaned as a battered sedan pulled up, its engine idling with a tired, rhythmic knock. Detective Park Jae-hoon stepped out, adjusting his wrinkled trench coat and squinting at the mansion through bloodshot eyes. He was a man built of patience and bad coffee, and he had been circling the Kang family like a vulture for 3 years. Danielle spotted him from the sunroom. She saw the gardener working near the front drive, his back turned, his shoulders tight with the tension of a cornered wolf. If Park got close enough to see the precision in Joon-seok's movements or the scars on his hands, the masquerade would shatter before the coup even began. She didn't wait for the doorbell. Danielle hurried out onto the gravel path, clutching a heavy tray of refreshments. She moved with a calculated, awkward gait, her shoulders slumped to hide her height. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked, her voice pitched higher, laced with a nervous, airy tremor. Park didn't look at her, his eyes were fixed on the gardener. "Detective," he corrected, flashing a badge that had seen better days. "I'm looking for the master of the house. I heard he was away, but I see you've hired a new hand." He started to walk toward Joon-seok. Danielle's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't flinch. As Park drew within 10 feet of the gardener, Danielle executed a flawless accident. She tripped on a protruding stone, her body twisting with theatrical clumsiness. The silver tray flew from her hands. Cold lemonade and a dozen crystal glasses rained down, shattering across the detective's expensive Italian leather shoes and the hem of his coat. Oh heavens, I am so sorry," Danielle cried out, falling to her knees and frantically grabbing at the shards. "I'm so clumsy, please let me. Oh, your coat." Park jumped back with a curse, flapping his wet sleeves. The gardener used the distraction to retreat into the shadows of the tall hedges, disappearing with the silence of a ghost. "Damn it, girl," Park hissed, looking down at his soaked trousers. The sharp, observant light in his eyes was momentarily replaced by the mundane irritation of a man with a ruined suit. "I'll get a towel, please. Don't tell Madame Yoon," Danielle pleaded, her eyes wide and brimming with fake, terrified tears. She looked exactly like a destitute maid terrified of losing her job, utterly unremarkable and beneath suspicion. Park sighed, his shoulders dropping. He looked toward the hedges, but the gardener was gone. He looked back at the clumsy girl kneeling in the dirt, dismissed her as a non-threat, and turned back toward his car. Forget it. Just tell your boss I'll be back when he's home. As the sedan retreated down the drive, Danielle stood up. She wiped the fake tears away, her face settling back into a mask of cold, tactical focus. From behind the hedge, Joon-seok's dark eyes met hers. No words were needed. The shadow had held, but the clock was ticking. The sky over the estate turned a bruised, sickly purple as a late summer typhoon rolled in, lashing the windows with a fury that shook the very foundations of the house. Inside the darkened nursery, the air was thick with electricity and the scent of ozone. Min-jun stood protectively in front of his sister, his small frame rigid as Seo Hye-rin loomed over them, her face contorted into a mask of hysterical rage. "You little brat!" Hye-rin shrieked, her voice competing with the roar of thunder. She held up a shredded designer dress, the silk ruined by a spilled glass of juice. "Do you have any idea what this cost? More than your life is worth to me." Hye-rin's hand flew back, and before Min-jun could flinch, she delivered a stinging slap that sent the boy reeling into the toy chest. "Sue," Ah let out a piercing, jagged sob, clutching her headless bear to her chest. The door didn't just open, it glided. Danielle entered the room, her silhouette illuminated by a sudden flash of lightning that turned the world white. She saw the red mark blooming on Min-jun's cheek, and in that heartbeat, the black maid vanished. The slouch in her shoulders evaporated, replaced by a spine of tempered steel. "That is enough," Danielle said. Her voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, vibrating hum, the sound of a predator deciding where to bite. Hye-rin spun around, her eyes wide with shock. "How dare you speak to me?" She stopped mid-sentence. Danielle was walking toward her, but she wasn't moving like a servant anymore. Each step was measured, silent, and predatory. Danielle stopped inches from Hye-rin's face, her deep brown eyes turning as cold and impenetrable as obsidian. The burn mark on her wrist seemed to glow in the dim light, a badge of a history Hye-rin couldn't fathom. Danielle didn't raise a hand. She didn't need to. She simply leveled a look of such absolute, lethal authority at the woman that the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. It was the gaze of a woman who had seen empires fall and men die in the dirt, a look that told Hye-rin she was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "If you ever lay a finger on these children again," Danielle whispered, her words cutting through the thunder like a razor, "I will not report you to the master. I will simply remove you. Do I make myself clear?" Hye-rin's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her knees buckled slightly, her primitive instincts screaming at her that she was standing in the presence of a superior killer. Shaking, her face drained of color, the mistress of the house stumbled backward, turned, and fled into the hallway. Danielle didn't watch her go. She immediately knelt by Min-jun, her touch turning soft and clinical as she checked his jaw. Outside, through the rain-streaked glass, she saw a flicker of movement near the tool shed. Joon-seok was there, drenched to the bone, watching the nursery window. He had seen the mask slip, and for the first time he saw not just a protector but his equal. The storm had passed, leaving behind a dripping, treacherous silence that felt more dangerous than the thunder. Within the gilded cage of the Kang estate, the trap was finally springing. Joon-seok had officially departed for the docks an hour ago, leaving the mansion vulnerable, or so Baek Do-hyun believed. Danielle sat in the center of the nursery, the lights dimmed to a low, amber glow. Min-jun and Soo-ah were asleep on the floor beside her, tucked into a makeshift fortress of cushions. She didn't look like a maid. She had discarded her apron and her sleeves were rolled up, revealing the burn-scarred skin of a survivor. In her lap lay the matte black pruning knife Joon-seok had given her. Alongside a heavy silver candlestick, she had waited with lead from the garden shed. The floorboards in the hallway groaned, a heavy, rhythmic tread that didn't belong to the house staff. "Open the door, Danielle," Do-hyun's voice rumbled through the wood, stripped of its usual facade of respect. "The master won't be coming back. The children need to be moved to a secure location for their own safety. Don't make this difficult." "The children aren't going anywhere," Danielle replied. Her voice was flat, devoid of fear, vibrating with the clinical coldness of a combat medic on the front lines. The door handle rattled violently, then the wood splintered as a heavy shoulder slammed against it. Danielle stood up, her movement fluid and silent. She didn't retreat. She stepped into the center of the room, positioning herself as a physical wall between the door and the sleeping children. The door burst open. Do-hyun stepped in, flanked by two stone-faced enforcers with earpieces and cold eyes. He took one look at Danielle, at her stance, the grip she had on the pruning knife, and the predatory stillness in her eyes, and he paused. "I knew there was something about you," Do-hyun spat, reaching for the pistol tucked into his waistband. "You're a ghost, aren't you? Some special ops stray he picked up." "I'm the woman who's going to keep you in this room until the real master arrives," Danielle countered. One of the enforcers lunged, reaching for her throat. Danielle didn't flinch. She used the gardening tip Joon-seok had taught her, stepping into the man's space and using his own momentum to drive her elbow into his solar plexus. As he gasped for air, she spun, the pruning knife flashing in the dim light as she sliced the tendons in his reaching hand. "Min-jun, get behind the desk," she commanded, her voice a whip-crack of authority. Do-hyun leveled his weapon, his face twisted in a snarl. "You're good, maid, but you aren't faster than a bullet." "Maybe not," a deep, familiar rasp echoed from the doorway behind him, "but I am." The enforcers froze. Standing in the shadows of the hallway was the gardener, his overalls splattered with grease, but his hand holding a suppressed tactical pistol with the steady, lethal grace of a king. The trap hadn't been for Joon-seok at the docks. It had been for the traitors in his own house. The nursery was a cage of shadows, the air vibrating with the low hum of impending violence. Baek Do-hyun stood frozen, his pistol leveled at Danielle, but his eyes were fixed on the figure emerging from the hallway. The gardener didn't stumble or bow. He moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, his weathered green overalls unzipped and discarded on the floor like a shed skin. Beneath the disguise, Kang Joon-seok wore a tailored black tactical suit that moved like a second layer of muscle. The baseball cap was gone, revealing the sharp, lethal symmetry of his face and the cold, unblinking eyes of a king who had returned to claim his throne. He didn't look like a man who had spent the morning pulling weeds. He looked like the personification of a death sentence. "You were always better at counting money than reading people, Do-hyun," Joon-seok rasped, his voice dropping the rustic accent for a tone that sounded like grinding stones. "Kill him," Do-hyun screamed, his voice cracking with a sudden, desperate realization of his mistake. The two enforcers lunged. They were elite mercenaries, trained for high-stakes hits, but against Joon-seok they looked like children playing with fire. The gardener moved with the fluid, lethal speed of a panther. He didn't waste motion. As the first guard raised a weapon, Joon-seok closed the gap in a single, explosive stride. He caught the man's wrist, the bone snapping with a sickening crunch, and used the guard's own momentum to drive him headfirst into the doorframe. The second enforcer fired a suppressed round, but Joon-seok was already gone, a shadow in the dim amber light. He reappeared at the man's flank, his hand striking out in a blur. A precise palm strike to the chin sent the guard's head snapping back, followed by a sweeping kick that took the man's legs out from under him. Before the guard hit the floor, Joon-seok had already disarmed him, the confiscated pistol now held with a steady, terrifying familiarity. Danielle stood her ground, her body still shielded by the desk where the children huddled. She watched Joon-seok work, her nurse's eyes tracking the clinical efficiency of his strikes. There was no rage in his movements, only a cold, mathematical certainty. He was clearing his garden of pests. In less than 30 seconds, the room was silent again, save for the ragged breathing of the fallen men. Joon-seok stepped over the bodies, his polished boots silent on the carpet. He didn't look at the traitors. He looked at Danielle. For a moment, the lethal king and the black maid stood in the center of the nursery, the air between them thick with a mutual, dangerous understanding. "The house is being purged," Joon-seok said, his voice softening only slightly as his gaze shifted to his children. "But the snake's head is still in the grand hall. Stay here. Secure the perimeter." "I don't take orders from the gardener anymore," Danielle replied, her grip tightening on the pruning knife. Joon-seok's lips quirked into the ghost of a smile, a dark, admiring expression. "Then come, let's finish this." The grand hall was a cavern of cold marble and flickering shadows, the air tasting of ozone and betrayal. Seo Hye-rin stood by the massive mahogany desk, her fingers white-knuckled as she clutched a glass of whiskey that rattled against her teeth. She didn't hear the doors open. She only felt the sudden, suffocating shift in the room's pressure. Joon-seok stepped into the light, his tactical suit slick with the rain and blood of the men he had neutralized in the hallway. He didn't look like a gardener anymore. He looked like an executioner. He tossed a thick folder onto the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Sign it, Hye-rin," Joon-seok rasped, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "The confession of every account you drained, every offshore shell company you opened with Do-hyun, and the names of every captain you bribed to turn against me." Hye-rin's face was a mask of ruined porcelain, her eyes darting toward the side entrance where Baek Do-hyun was emerging from the shadows. The right-hand man was battered, his charcoal suit torn, but his eyes were filled with the frantic, cornered energy of a dying animal. He wasn't looking at Joon-seok. He was looking at the children. "If I'm going down, Joon-seok, I'm taking the legacy with me," Do-hyun roared, lunging toward Min-jun and Soo-ah with a serrated blade he had pulled from his boot. He never reached them. Danielle moved with the clinical precision of a scalpel. She intercepted him in the center of the hall, her body a blur of white apron and dark, focused intent. She didn't use the pruning knife. She used the physics of his own desperation. She caught his lead arm, pivoted on her heel, and drove her palm into the base of his skull while simultaneously sweeping his lead leg. Do-hyun hit the marble with a sickening thud, the air leaving his lungs in a wheezing gasp. Danielle didn't stop. She pinned his arm behind his back with a knee to his spine, her hand moving to the pressure point at the base of his jaw. "Stay down," she whispered, her voice a chilling contrast to the chaos. "I know exactly where to press to make sure you never walk again." Joon-seok didn't even turn his head to watch the struggle. His eyes remained fixed on Hye-rin, who was now trembling so violently she could barely hold the pen he had thrust into her hand. "The pen, Hye-rin," Joon-seok commanded, leaning over the desk until his shadow swallowed her whole. "Sign, and you live to see the inside of a cell. Refuse, and you become part of the garden I've been tending for months." With a jagged, sobbing breath, Hye-rin scrawled her name across the bottom of the document. The moment the ink dried, the heavy front doors burst open. It wasn't the Mafia. It was Detective Park Jae-hoon and a tactical team, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. Joon-seok stood tall, his hands empty and visible, a king standing over his reclaimed court. He looked at Danielle, who was still shielding the children, her eyes meeting his with a silent, ironclad bond. The purge was complete. The weeds had been pulled. The golden light of a new dawn broke over the Kang estate, filtering through the charred remains of the garden gazebo and reflecting off the polished marble of the grand hall. The chaos of the night had been replaced by a heavy, reverent silence. The sirens had long since faded, and the traitors had been hauled away into the shadow of the law and the syndicate's reach. Joon-seok stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the ruined flower patch. He was no longer the gardener in stained overalls, nor the frantic hunter of the night before. He wore a crisp, tailored black suit, his presence commanding and absolute. Beside him stood Danielle. She had washed the grime and blood from her hands, but she had not put on a fresh uniform. Instead, she wore a simple, elegant dress of deep charcoal, her curls free and her gaze unwavering. "The children are still sleeping," Danielle said, her voice a calm anchor in the aftermath. "The trauma will take time to heal, but they are safe." Joon-seok turned to her. The coldness that had defined his eyes for years had thawed into something resembling profound respect. "They are safe because of you. I spent months looking for a mole, but I never realized I had invited a lioness into my home to guard my cubs." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. He didn't offer a diamond or a ring of submission. When he opened it, a subtle gold pin glinted in the morning light. It was a stylized crest of the Kang Syndicate, but intertwined with a nursing caduceus, a symbol of protection and healing forged in steel. "I told you once that the maid was replaceable," Joon-seok said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rasp. "I was wrong. The maid never existed. You were always the partner I didn't know I was looking for." He stepped forward and pinned the crest to her lapel. The weight of it was a declaration. In the world of the Syndicate, this wasn't just jewelry. It was a badge of absolute authority. "I won't be returning to the kitchen, Joon-seok," Danielle said, a faint, knowing smirk playing on her lips as she looked at the pin. "I wouldn't dream of it," he replied, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his guarded exterior. "The Syndicate needs a moral core. It needs someone who knows how to pull a weed without killing the garden." As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the estate, they walked toward the nursery together. The hierarchy had been dismantled and rebuilt in a single night. The invisible servant was gone, and the era of a new dynasty had begun, one built not just on power, but on the fierce, unbreakable bond between a king and the woman who had saved his world.